would really tonight just like to spend a few minutes with you in Bible study, and I do kind of mean that. Just a really simple examination of a central passage, and we'll look at it together, and then we'll go about our evenings. And if the good Lord wills it and works with us, we can grab a hold of these principles and look for ways to live them throughout the week. And so I need you, please, to have your Old Testaments open to Job chapter 31. Job 31, and the argument that Job makes there will be the centerpiece of our study. I want to tell you just a moment about how that came together. I taught a lesson last week on hospitality. We looked at the first century church, what it means to be a first century-like Christian. We saw how the open home and the giving spirit, the love of brethren and strangers, is basically central to Christian faith. And so we kind of tried to develop some of that. I appreciate the kind comments about that and those who are making special and new efforts in that way. That's what this is all about, just learning and growing and trying to get better. Well, somewhere around that time, I didn't get to teach this last week because of the ice and stuff, but a week or two ago, I was talking to my friend Reagan McClinney. A lot of you guys know Reagan, and I was telling him about, hey, I'm going to do this sermon on hospitality, and I'm going to go through the first century church. And he said, well, I think if you're going to do a sermon on hospitality, you need to use Job 31. And I was kind of like, yeah, definitely Job 31. And he's like, there's no better lesson on hospitality than that. And I said, you're right. That's what I was thinking too, So I got off the phone, I'm like, Job 31? Like, what could possibly be in this story? And think about it. Don't read ahead, just think about it. Like, what could possibly be in this story about hospitality? And let me just remind you, you don't need a long introduction. Let me just remind you what happened in this story. Job had everything. He had 10 kids, he had servants and goods, and somewhere in the heavenly realm there was a conversation between the adversary, the devil, and God, and God's like, look at the faithfulness of Job, and he was wonderfully faithful. I love how he made regular offerings on behalf of his kids in chapter 1. And the devil said, if I take away all that, he'll fall to pieces. And so God let him do that, remember? And so now Job loses the servants, and he loses the goods, and he loses all 10 of his kids in one moment of time. And yet he stays faithful to God. Satan comes back and says, let me do more. If you let me touch his body, that'll do it. And so God allows him to do that. And now he's got sores all over his body. In chapter 2, his own wife is sort of out on all of this, which you can imagine. And he holds his integrity through all that, but not without much angst and anxiety. And that's what the big part of the book of Job is about. It's about him sitting there for 7 days in total silence, completely clueless on what's going on. And then his 3 and ultimately 4 friends show up. Do you guys kind of know the way the full narrative in the middle works? It's basically a big chunk of chapters where his friends deliver him this message. There is a reason why you're suffering. Your suffering is the result of your sin. Now, it's easy for you and me to think, well, that was short-sighted. And that missed the real point, and they were wrong, all of which was true, but were they really that wrong? I mean, don't we still think that way? Isn't it consistent with God that if you are behaving in an ungodly way and you are living in ungodly behavior, you can expect punishment from God? And in fact, if the ultimate punishment is hell, I hope you welcome punishment from God. Straighten me up. So for them to say, Job, you need to come clean about what you're doing, because if you'll repent, then God will restore blessings to you, is a pretty great message if it were true. Of course, in that story, it was not true. It was a different kind of test going on, which is sometimes the case with us. And so Job goes through these series of defenses where he's like, guys, I see what you're saying, but you're basically the worst. And in the meantime, of course, Job wants his moment with God. He's frustrated with God. I think that's probably a mild way of putting it. And he wants to ask God about it. And you know how the book ends up. Finally, God's like, what you got? And Job had nothing. And God just pelts him with all these questions. And Job is humbled. And he appeals to God. And God restores, in a sense, his fortune. Gives him 10 other kids. So he's got 20 souls in heaven that he can spend time with later. But he gives him 10 kids. Gives him all these things back. And ultimately, God says, Job was righteous through all of this. I know he got a little shady there at some points. He was so upset. But he was faithful, and the Lord stood against the people, the men. So, okay, where's hospitality in any of that? I don't see it. Well, Job 31 may show it to you anyway. Here's the basic setup. We'll go through this and we'll be done. Here's the basic setup. It's a righteous man's defense of his integrity. Somebody says, you've got a lot of bad things happening. You must have committed some super bad sins, Because we all know there are some things that God just won't put up with, and you've clearly done those things. And so what Job's doing in chapter 31, he's saying, I know what those sins are. And if I was, I'll show you a little bit of this design, like if I was actually committing those sins, yeah, God would crush me for those sins. All sin is the same, but let's be honest. We know there are some things we stumble in every once in a while and God's with us. But we know there are some sins that if you just jump into that stuff and stay there, God is going to crush you. That's what they're saying. He's saying, but I'm not. I'm not living in I know those are terrible things. I'm not in those things, and so I'm back to why is this happening? Now, that sounds somewhat familiar to us. That's the flow of the middle of the letter. If you guys are right, I'm on board with you. He needs to, I think at one point he says, he needs to break my arm if that's what I'm doing. But because I'm not, I'm okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to see what some of those bad boys are. What are some of those deep, dark, nasty, ongoing sins that would obviously necessitate God's wrath? Well, the first one I think you're going to be totally on board with. The first one is immorality. I mean, could the Bible say any more about immorality? From the beginning to the end, the idea that we use our body for sexual deviancy, we go around God's good marital plan, is all bad business. He said, look, if I have been immoral, yeah, living in immorality is begging God to wake me up. And that's the opening section. Let's read a couple verses. He said, look, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? Is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? Does he not see my steps and see my ways and number all my steps? God crushes immoral people. God wakes them up. He shakes them loose. And even in the New Testament, when there was someone living in sexual immorality in the church, Paul was like, you better fix that. God reacts very, very poorly to sexual deviancy. He said, I know that, but I made a covenant with my eyes. He might be saying, look, I'm not going to say I've always been perfect, but I do not give myself over to this. He goes on to talk about that further as you move through the text, where he says in verse 9, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, and then he goes pretty graphic. May my wife grind for another, and let others kneel down over her. For that would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by the judges. For it would be fire that consumes the Abaddon and would uproot all my increase. So we're done with this point. But we could build a whole sermon on this point. And if we spent the whole time just making this point, I think people would come up to me afterwards and go, we needed that. That's true. If you're going to be a fornicator, or you're going to live in pornography, or you're going to lust after someone, all these things Jesus said not to do, you better repent of that. Because if that's the life you're choosing to live, then you may as well welcome God to crush you, because you need Him to crush you. You need something. But if you've been pure, it should go better. So that's his point. So I think we'd all go, man, this Job 31 is good. I think I'm going to start using that when I'm talking to people about immorality. You'd be doing great. Here's the second one. He says, we know that deceitfulness is a terrible sin. Lying in a way that is conniving and selfish. And you go to like Revelation 21, remember this? And you have this list of these awful murderers and abominable people, and they're in this lake of fire, and right there in the list is liars. And we know that Jesus said, like, let your yes be yes, your no be no. If I am a liar, then I need God to crush me before it's too late and He has to cast me away. To live deceitful. And by that I mean to try to get it over on other people. And it's not just lying, it's manipulation. Everybody knows that would be awful. And so he talks about that. Look in verse 5. If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened after deceit, let him weigh me with accurate scales. Let God know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, let me sow and another reap. Let my crops be uprooted. Let me add a little bit to this, verses maybe 13 through 15. If I have despised the claim of my male and female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him and of the same fashion as us in the womb? Like he made them and he made me. So here's what he's saying. He's saying, look, I get it. If I have been deceitful, if I have lied about people, the Bible talks about gossip and slander. You know all these ideas, right? If someone brought a case against me, and instead of being honest about my mistakes, I just make them look bad, and I hide and I lie. Well, yeah, God should be punishing me. I think that's an interesting thing to capture in your mind. I'm trying to say it in a way you'll get. Like, why would you go, if I'm a liar, God needs to punish me? Because we just don't want to go to hell. We don't want to be punished forever. So I ought to have an attitude that receives that. But he said, I've been honest. I have not disregarded someone for their complaint. And so if we use Job 31 to say, deceitfulness will crush you and you need to be honest, I think you would go, that's a good sermon. Like that, Job 31 is a great place to go for that. And then we could go to James, and James talks about greed, but there's also a passage in James where it talks about not paying your mowers, I think. Maybe they had fields and they were being mowed. And he said, the rich among you, they just are conniving. And they're always looking to win out. And so they treat poorly the poor, and they're always looking for that advantage. They don't care who they hurt. Well, yeah. The text says in James 5, that person's going to be subject to judgment. Okay, so I think so far I got you on board. It's a big bait and switch. You're baited. These things are a big deal, not a little deal. Those two things on the right, not just things you might want to try out. They're things you're going to want to live. Okay, cool. End of sermon, right? No, there's two more. He said, look, if I have been greedy with my money, if I have been greedy with my goods, if I have overlooked the needs of friends, and he's going to talk about neighbors, he's going to talk about enemies even, which is an interesting one. If I have not been charitable, then God should crush me. Okay, have I lost you? I think I just lost you. Let me slow this thing down. Look, everybody would pray that about the first thing. If I'm living in sexual sin, then I'm subject to God's judgment. Everybody would say that about the second thing. If I'm living in deceitfulness and oppression, I deserve. But would everybody say, if I have been greedy and I am not charitable, then I have crossed a line that would mean that whatever God did to punish me is warranted? Let me show you a couple of the verses. Verse 16, we'll go down through about verse 25. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel, get this, alone, and the orphan has not shared it, but from my youth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan, because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket, and my arm be broken off at the elbow. For calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty, I can do nothing. Well, this just got serious. Is that the way you and I look at the way we use our blessings? Is that the way we look at our responsibility, verse 16, to those who are poor, to the widow who has failed to get what she needs? Do we eat our morsels while those who have no morsel go without? Verse 17, sometimes even people that we know. Are there those that we know who are cold while we are warm? Those who are exposed and need help. Any part of us that says, you got to get these first two things right, but the next two things are lesser, I think we've missed Jesus. I told you to be short tonight, and it will be. I'm almost done. But we could walk all the way through the ministry of Jesus. You know what we're going to find? Love for people. Love for neighbors, love for enemies. They used money to help the poor. He talked about helping the poor. The Gospels talk about helping the poor, the very thing Paul said we are eager to do, which is help the poor. The Bible talks about in James chapter 1, you know this verse pretty well. You know in James 1 that it says pure and undefiled religion. What is pure and undefiled religion? It's helping it's right here, the widow and the orphan in need. It's seeing people in need. If I am being greedy, and I have, and those God puts in my circle have not, is that a big deal or a little deal? I'm not here to tell you what to do. I told you this morning, I think I'm just done with that. People don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be told what to think. And I'm talking about, I don't like it, you don't like it, and it doesn't change anything anyway. I'm asking you who you want to become. Who you are. Are you a righteous person? Are you someone who wants to live like Jesus? These are the qualities that promote that, being charitable. Now, he adds a little something to this. He talks in verse 24 and 25, if I have put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, if I have gloated because my wealth was great and because my hand had secured so much. And he talks about the sun and these other things. Then verse 28, my iniquity calls for I'm just, preaching is funny. It's me working on me and you're in the room. But I'm working on this idea of, have I made this like a B-side issue and immorality the A-side issue? And have I gotten to a point where I can say, if I've been greedy and selfish and ignored the needs of people, hospitality and kindness and service, then I am calling for judgment. Because what makes me want to do is be more radical in my faithfulness. Now, radical will be different everywhere you go. I've got some friends in Ethiopia right now. To say that it's radical for an Ethiopian to give their last, I almost said penny or something, their last blanket, their last pair of shoes to help a stranger, that's not radical over there. They haven't had much, they don't treasure much, they give everything, it seems. For them, radical might be something else. Maybe it's a culture where being moral is radical. But for me, for us, maybe it's about seeing them all the same. Here's the final one. I'm going to use some language here, afraid. And I just want you to kind of follow along with this with me. And there's our word, hospitable. Now, we've already seen hospitality somewhat in verses 16 through 23. It's not just in your home. It's about seeing people who have need and realizing like it's a part of my faith to help them. But look at the rest of this. Chapter 31, Job 31, 29. Have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exulted when evil befell him? No. I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for his life in a curse. Have the men of my tent not said, who can find one who has not been satisfied with his food, with his meat? Now I want to stop there because I think this is like a really cool big point. When they say in verse 31, is there anybody around here who hasn't eaten at Job's table? That's a cool point. I think it'd be neat for somebody to say, oh, you know this family? They've probably taken you out somewhere. They've probably given you something. They've probably done something for you. They're just always looking for that. It's a really cool point to say, is there anybody around here who hasn't been in some way taken care of by them? But the context is his enemy. His enemies. It looks like what he's saying is most people are praying like death to their enemies, and I can't find any of Job's enemies that haven't had lunch at his house. That's awesome. That is hospitality unchained. Remember we talked a little bit about it last week, how Jesus would invite people over, how Matthew opened his home to even the tax collectors and the sinners and the red light district, and how even the Pharisees would invite someone over for dinner and then talk things out, even when it was Jesus and they weren't sure about him. The idea is hospitality has no bounds to it because it's not something you do, it's who you are. It's who I am. Who are you? I'm the kind of person who tries to help anyone who needs anything, who loves everyone all the time, and especially tries to use this for those that I've at odds with. Don't tell me that divisions don't grow when we cold shoulder, when we close our doors, And I hope we don't pray for them all to die. Like, it just gets worse and worse. His way is better. Keep going. It's not just the enemy, and that's kind of like adjacently added there. It looks like the men would include the enemy. He goes on to say, verse 32, the alien, the stranger, has not lodged outside. For I have opened my doors to the traveler. Have I covered my transgressions like Adam? What transgressions? Selfishness, closed door, empty tables, fear, getting there, fear, keep these guys away. I don't know that guy. The guy's a traveler. He's a stranger. Now, I get it. They're crazy, wild people in this world. You got to put a couple of barriers in mind. But for the most part, God puts people in our lives to demonstrate something very special and beautiful. The alien, can you find me an alien hasn't lodged here? People who've opened their doors. He said, look, I'm not covering that. Then he says this. I find it very interesting. He says, by hiding my iniquity. Because, why'd you hide it? Well, because I feared, verse 34, I feared the great multitude. He said, is this what I've done? I feared the great multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, and I kept silent, and I did not go outside. Is that what I did? Or that I had one to hear me? Behold, here he's saying, God, I come and bear witness. Here is my signature. Let God answer me. In other words, I have not made that mistake. The reason I put fear over here, I get that it's a bigger idea in verse 34. It's like, have I operated in fear of what other people think? No. Have I operated in fear of what others might do to me? No. But in the context, what's he saying? He's saying, I have opened my home to people, even my enemies, if possible. I have tried to help anyone. I put myself out there. I don't live in fear. Again, there's some care that has to be taken. But I don't live in fear of what might happen if I am kind. I don't live in fear, and this is kind of a side issue, of what people will say. What do people say about Matthew and Jesus? What did they say about him when the first thing they did was had a bunch of sinners over for lunch? We know what they said. They said, this is not godliness. It's ungodly. And Jesus looked at them and said, you're fools. And you're afraid. You're afraid and you're fools. I don't want to be like that. But the question is, can I read Job 31 and say, the same intensity I would make points 1 and 2, I want to make that same intensity for 3 and 4. You guys know that, I don't want to say like part of anyone's history or part of any church's history. I don't want to categorize anyone. But the idea of grading sins is not an uncommon thing. Big ones, little ones, fellowship ones, non-fellowship ones. Like, let's just become the people who are righteous. And it will all fill in beautifully. Let me finish with, I'm gonna spare everyone Matthew 25. I just don't think my emotions can handle it tonight. But I will take you back to Luke 14. You know Matthew 25 where he paints the judgment scene. Remember, this whole idea is, it's not, hey, we should be hospitable because that's a good idea. The whole point of Job 31 is, if I have been afraid to be kind, if I have been greedy and not hospitable, then I know why God took my children from me. I know why God put sores all over my body. He is rendering judgment to me. Like, that's the context. Well, what's interesting in Matthew 25 where Jesus says, is somebody hungry and you feed them? Are they thirsty and you give them something to drink? Are they naked and you clothe them? And I think the context there is about Christians who are going through some stuff. But he said, in the judgment, that's the kind of conversation we're going to have. That's the conversation we're going to have is, I put these people right in front of you. Tell me about how that went. And that's what he said judgment will be based on. In Luke 14, I just wanted to tie together, and I'm closing this up, I just wanted to tie together some things this morning about counting cost, and a lot of this is costly. If you're struggling with any of this, that thing is costly. If you struggle with immorality, with pornography, with problems, like, it's going to be costly to fix. It's going to really cost a lot, but it's that big of a deal, and it means that much to God, so we're going to do it. Well, it could be something else for someone else. But in this text, he said you have to calculate the cost. And we know that he said even things like hating your own family. And what he means is being willing to be hated by your own family for your faith. And then he said in verse 27, you got to carry that cross and come after me. And that's how you become a disciple. And then he throws that cherry on top in verse 33 and says, you can't, your possessions can't be about you and you be about me. Your possessions can't be for you and you be for me. Your possessions have to be for me because you're for me and they're a part of you and all of you belongs to me. Like, what an amazing concept. And on the not the heels of that, but to go just before that, I just want to finish with this little story. Luke 14. Luke 14, and he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may invite you in return. You're like, isn't that the point? I mean, sometimes it is, but he said that'll just be like tit for tat. That'll be just repayment. He said when you give a reception, invite, and this is what Job was talking about. And this is what Matthew, invite the poor. Invite the crippled. Invite the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you. That's the reason you'll be blessed, because you were charitable and hospitable and honest. And then he finishes, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. What an interesting play on words. You know what it costs to do that? It costs stuff. It costs time. It costs focus. It probably costs money. It costs things. He said, here's the thing. It's going to cost you to be righteous in relationships and hospitable, but in the judgment, I will repay you for what it cost. Please don't let cost stop you of any ilk from being the kind of person who lives out the Spirit of Jesus in the way you interact and deal with other people. And so what I would say here at the end is, just to close, that Job 31 is interesting. I didn't like it as much as Reagan thought I would. I didn't like it at all, really. Because it takes things that I'm strong on and says, good job, because that's a huge deal. And then it takes things that I'm not so strong on and says, same story. I thought about this morning that's hard, especially time and energy, and we get so busy and there's so much going on, and we're not like dishonest and deceitful, but it's hard to be charitable and it's hard to go out of your way. But I was just thinking, and I don't want to over dramatize it, but I don't know that I can. One day, I'm going to be in front of Jesus, and you are too. And when I get there, let me just ask you, when you're in front of Jesus, what do you have in your life that you would not give up that very second to go to heaven? I mean, give it up. Bank account? Goods? Stuff? Like, when we face Jesus and we realize that this is gone and that is all that matters, this is carnal and that's eternal, I think we would probably give up everything. But you know what faith is? Like, faith is living towards that before you see it. Because once we see it, it'll be a story that's already been told. So I'm just telling you, I'm working on this. I'm working on an attitude towards righteousness that includes a lack of fear and more charity. Because we can talk about collective and individual and what church funds do and all this. That's a neat and interesting conversation. But God's people are charitable, end of discussion. That's just what God's people are. And that's what I want to be, and I want your help. So thank you for your time and attention. This is kind of a follow-up on last week, and may the Lord soften our hearts, and may He help us see what matters and use the things that matter less to lay up the treasures that matter more. And that's going to be the way you love people. May we love them well. If you need encouragement, we're here to give it to you. If you need to ask for prayers and help and support, you know that you're loved. And if you need Jesus, well, let me rephrase. You need Jesus. If you do not have a relationship with Him, the beautiful thing about this is He looks at this list, and I'm not grading myself well on all of this. And yet, by the patience of God, we got today, and we get forgiven, and we have tomorrow. And we can do better. I just want to do better. If you want His grace to help you do better, then respond to Him as we stand and sing.